Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Mark Davis had always felt like a stranger in his own life. At just 23, he was juggling his final year of law school with a part-time job, trying desperately to escape the weight of his family's debt. It was a constant struggle, and every day seemed like a fight he was losing. But Mark wasn't the type to give up. He tried to hide his stress behind a mask of calm, but inside, he was suffocating. He walked the rain-soaked streets of the small Texas town, the weight of his backpack pulling him down, his mind consumed by the mounting bills and the looming threat of losing his mother's house. With every step, it felt as if the walls were closing in on him. The world outside was cold and indifferent, just like the people he had met at job fairs, offering polite smiles, but no real hope. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering, knowing that another bill collector was probably on the other end. But when he heard the voice on the other side, it was not what he expected. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I need to speak with you about your financial situation." Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. "Eleanor Brooks? How do you know about me?" The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "I know enough," she said. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." Before Mark could protest, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in disbelief. Eleanor Brooks? The name meant nothing to him. But the mention of his financial struggles, it hit too close to home. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but there was something in her tone, something that made him feel like he couldn't ignore her. As he walked into the small bistro that evening, the cold rain still falling outside, Mark couldn't shake the unease in his chest. The place was warm, cozy, a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside. Inside, the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of baked bread, creating an inviting atmosphere. At a corner table, a woman sat waiting. She was striking, tall, with silver hair pulled back into a sleek bun. Her tailored suit and composed demeanor suggested she was someone used to being in control. As Mark approached, she looked up, her sharp blue eyes meeting his, appraising him without saying a word. "You must be Mark," she said, her voice calm but firm. He nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Yes, I'm Mark Davis." He hesitated, then asked, "I'm not sure I understand. What's this about?" Eleanor set her cup of tea down, her fingers tracing the rim lightly before she spoke. "I've been keeping an eye on your situation, Mr. Davis. The debts you're struggling with, the house you're about to lose. I can help you." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Help me? I don't even know you." She smiled faintly, her gaze never wavering. "You will. I'm offering you a deal. I'm a wealthy woman with no family, no heirs. You're young, with nothing left to lose. Marry me, Mark. Think of it as a business arrangement. In return, I'll pay off all your debts, secure your future, and take care of your family's financial problems." Mark blinked, stunned. He had heard of people getting into all sorts of ridiculous situations to solve their problems, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "I am. There's no love involved, Mark. Just a mutual agreement. You'll have everything you need, money, security, a future. I'll help you rebuild everything. What's the alternative? Watching your family lose everything." Mark's mind raced. It sounded too good to be true. But then again, what choice did he have? His life was falling apart. The house his mother had worked so hard for was about to slip through his fingers. This could be the answer. He could finally breathe again. But at what cost? He sat back in his chair, his mind torn between his pride and his desperation. This wasn't just a simple offer. It was a chance to change everything, but it would come with strings attached. Could he really go through with it? Could he accept a life with no real love, only a promise of financial stability? "I'll need some time to think about it," he said quietly, trying to find his bearings. But Eleanor simply nodded, her expression unchanged. "Of course, but don't take too long. The offer won't stand forever." Mark nodded and stood up to leave, the weight of her proposal hanging heavy in his mind. As he stepped out into the night, The rain continued to pour, but for the first time in a long while, Mark felt like he had something to hold on to, even if he wasn't sure yet what it would cost him. As he walked back to his apartment, the thoughts of the deal swirled in his head. Could he really go through with it? Could he marry a woman he didn't love, just to save his family? He didn't know the answer yet, but one thing was certain. He was about to face a choice that would change his life forever. Mark stood by his apartment window, staring out at the city. The rain had stopped, but the weight of Eleanor's offer still hung heavy in the air. It was too much to process. He rubbed his temples, trying to think clearly. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, their future. His mind raced with the possibilities. Eleanor's deal seemed like the answer to all his problems. But was it worth it? Was he willing to give up everything he had ever believed in for financial stability? His phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. It was a message from his mother. The bills are piling up, Mark. What's going to happen? He stared at the screen for a moment before typing a quick response. I'm working on it, Mom. Don't worry, things will be okay. But even as he hit send, he knew deep down that he wasn't sure things would be okay. He couldn't ignore the growing anxiety gnawing at him. He couldn't keep avoiding this decision. Mark knew he had to go back to Brooks' Bistro. He had to make a choice, stay stuck in his old life, or take a leap of faith into the unknown. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the weight of the choices he had made up until now, and the kind of man he wanted to be. The following evening, Mark found himself walking back into the bistro. The place was quieter now, the rush of dinner service having died down. Eleanor was already seated at their usual table, her composed demeanor unchanged as she looked up from her tablet when he walked in. She didn't waste time. Have you decided? She asked, her tone businesslike, but there was a glimmer of curiosity behind her eyes. Mark stood still for a moment, weighing his options. His heart was pounding. He hadn't come to a clear decision yet, but there was something about her calm confidence that made him feel like he was running out of time. I've thought about it, he said, taking the seat across from her. I'm willing to go ahead with the agreement. Eleanor's lips twitched into a small smile, but there was no joy in it, just a quiet satisfaction, like she had expected him to agree. Good. Then let's get things started. As she laid out the details, how they would meet with a lawyer the following day to formalize the marriage, how they would present themselves as a couple in public, how everything would be carefully planned, Mark couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and dread. He had made his choice, but he still wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. Over the next few days, Mark found himself thrown into a whirlwind of paperwork and logistics. He met with Eleanor's lawyer to finalize the contract. He was surprised at how meticulous everything was, how everything was planned down to the last detail. There were no surprises, just cold, calculated precision. It felt like a business deal, not a marriage. The morning of their wedding, Mark woke up early, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. The house he had lived in with his mother felt colder than usual. The walls seemed to close in on him. He had spent so many years fighting to keep everything together, only to end up here. The weight of his decision felt heavier than ever. He arrived at the courthouse just as the sun began to rise, its light barely breaking through the clouds. Inside, Eleanor was already there, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, her expression serene but unreadable. A notary was waiting for them, ready to sign the paperwork. Mark hesitated at the door, his heart beating fast. He had come this far, but it felt like he was stepping into a world that wasn't his own. Eleanor noticed his pause, her gaze meeting his. You don't have to do this if you're not ready, she said softly, though her voice held no judgment. It was more of a statement than a suggestion. Mark looked at her, his mind racing. Could he really go through with it? Was this the only way to save his family, to save himself? The answer, as much as he wanted to deny it, was yes. He couldn't let his pride stand in the way of what needed to be done. Taking a deep breath, Mark walked forward. He took his place next to Eleanor, and as the notary spoke the words that would officially bind them, Mark felt the finality of the moment wash over him. There was no turning back now. Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis, Eleanor said as they stood up, her voice steady but with a hint of warmth. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just the quiet exchange of a legally binding contract. As they left the courthouse, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But he also knew, deep down, that he had no choice. The contract was signed. The deal was done, and now, there was no turning back. As they walked to the car, Eleanor turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "We'll make this work," she said. "You'll see. In time, this will be more than just a contract. It will be a partnership." Mark didn't respond. He wasn't sure what kind of partnership this would turn into, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had made the right choice after all. The following weeks passed in a blur. Mark tried to settle into his new life, but everything felt strange, like wearing someone else's clothes. The house he had moved into, Eleanor's sprawling estate, felt too quiet, too empty. He spent his days in meetings with her advisors, reviewing financial statements, and learning the ins and outs of her business empire. Eleanor was everywhere, constantly busy, managing her vast holdings with precision and control. She was never cruel, but she kept her distance. It was clear from the start that their marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement. He was just a name on a contract to her, no different from a hired employee. It was the life he had chosen, but it wasn't the one he had imagined. Mark knew that. He couldn't forget it, no matter how much he wanted to. He had hoped that maybe, somewhere along the way, the lines between their partnership and something real would blur. But that never happened. Instead, their interactions were mostly confined to boardroom meetings or brief exchanges at dinner, where Eleanor was always calm, collected, and completely professional. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon, several weeks after the wedding, that something changed. Mark had been spending his afternoon in the library, going over the latest figures for the business. The rain was pouring down outside, the soft tapping of the water against the windows a constant reminder of the dreary day. He had just finished reading an email when he heard a soft knock on the door. "Mark." Eleanor's voice was tentative, as though she was unsure whether to disturb him. He looked up from his work, surprised. She had never come to check on him before. "Come in," he said, his voice a little colder than he meant it to be. Eleanor stepped into the room, looking out of place in the cozy, quiet atmosphere of the library. She wasn't in her usual business attire. Today, she wore a simple sweater and jeans, her silver hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "I thought we could talk," she said softly, closing the door behind her. Mark raised an eyebrow. "About what?" he asked, his tone still a little guarded. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from him, the quiet of the room filling the space between them. "I know this isn't easy for you," she began, her voice calm, but filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I just wanted to check in." She leaned forward slightly, as though trying to gauge his response. Mark didn't know how to feel. He had never seen her like this before, vulnerable, even if just for a moment. "It's been fine," he said, his words more clipped than he intended. "I'm just adjusting." He didn't know what else to say. He had agreed to this arrangement, after all. He had chosen to enter into this partnership, this marriage for convenience. But there was something about her tone, the way she was looking at him, that made him wonder if she was feeling the same sense of distance. Perhaps they were both stuck in this strange, hollow version of a life that neither of them had truly wanted. Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face. "I know this is different. I know it's not the life either of us expected. But I hope you know, Mark, that you're not just a contract to me. I didn't marry you just for business. I didn't expect this to be easy. But I also didn't expect it to be so lonely." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. She had never opened up to him like this before. He wasn't sure how to process it. He had come into this thinking that he would keep his emotions locked away, just like he always did. But now, hearing her say that, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this arrangement than he had originally believed. For a moment, there was only silence between them. The sound of the rain on the window seemed to fill the entire room. Eleanor's gaze softened, and she looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her wedding ring. Mark didn't know what he was feeling, confusion, guilt, longing. It was all so tangled. "I didn't expect you to fall in love with me, Mark," Eleanor said quietly, almost as if to herself. "But I did hope we could be friends. I wanted more than just a business partner." Her words hung in the air, and Mark didn't know how to respond. He had always kept his emotions buried deep inside, afraid of letting anyone in. But now, sitting across from Eleanor, something inside him began to shift. Was he ready to let go of his walls? Was he ready to open up to this strange, complex woman who had, in her own way, tried to make this work? The tension between them lingered, but for the first time since their wedding, Mark felt something different. Maybe it was the rain outside or the way Eleanor had opened up to him. Whatever it was, it felt like a turning point, a moment that could change everything. Mark looked up at her, his expression softening. "Maybe we could start over," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we can try to figure this out, together." Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. She smiled, just a little, but it was enough to make Mark feel like maybe, just maybe, this partnership wasn't as hopeless as he had once thought. The following weeks passed in a blur. Mark tried to settle into his new life, but everything felt strange, like wearing someone else's clothes. The house he had moved into, Eleanor's sprawling estate, felt too quiet, too empty. He spent his days in meetings with her advisors, reviewing financial statements, and learning the ins and outs of her business empire. Eleanor was everywhere, constantly busy, managing her vast holdings with precision and control. She was never cruel, but she kept her distance. It was clear from the start that their marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement. He was just a name on a contract to her, no different from a hired employee. It was the life he had chosen, but it wasn't the one he had imagined. Mark knew that. He couldn't forget it, no matter how much he wanted to. He had hoped that maybe, somewhere along the way, the lines between their partnership and something real would blur. But that never happened. Instead, their interactions were mostly confined to boardroom meetings or brief exchanges at dinner, where Eleanor was always calm, collected, and completely professional. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon, several weeks after the wedding, that something changed. Mark had been spending his afternoon in the library, going over the latest figures for the business. The rain was pouring down outside, the soft tapping of the water against the windows a constant reminder of the dreary day. He had just finished reading an email when he heard a soft knock on the door. "Mark." Eleanor's voice was tentative, as though she was unsure whether to disturb him. He looked up from his work, surprised. She had never come to check on him before. "Come in," he said, his voice a little colder than he meant it to be. Eleanor stepped into the room, looking out of place in the cozy, quiet atmosphere of the library. She wasn't in her usual business attire today. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, her silver hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "I thought we could talk," she said softly, closing the door behind her. Mark raised an eyebrow. "About what?" he asked, his tone still a little guarded. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from him, the quiet of the room filling the space between them. "I know this isn't easy for you," she began, her voice calm, but filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I just wanted to check in." She leaned forward slightly, as though trying to gauge his response. Mark didn't know how to feel. He had never seen her like this before, vulnerable, even if just for a moment. "It's been fine," he said, his words more clipped than he intended. "I'm just adjusting." He didn't know what else to say. He had agreed to this arrangement, after all. He had chosen to enter into this partnership, this marriage for convenience. But there was something about her tone, the way she was looking at him, that made him wonder if she was feeling the same sense of distance. Perhaps they were both stuck in this strange, hollow version of a life that neither of them had truly wanted. Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face. "I know this is different. I know it's not the life either of us expected. But I hope you know, Mark, that you're not just a contract to me. I didn't marry you just for business. I didn't expect this to be easy. But I also didn't expect it to be so lonely." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. She had never opened up to him like this before. He wasn't sure how to process it. He had come into this thinking that he would keep his emotions locked away, just like he always did. But now, hearing her say that, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this arrangement than he had originally believed. For a moment, there was only silence between them. The sound of the rain on the window seemed to fill the entire room. Eleanor's gaze softened, and she looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her wedding ring. Mark didn't know what he was feeling, confusion, guilt, longing. It was all so tangled. "I didn't expect you to fall in love with me, Mark," Eleanor said quietly, almost as if to herself. "But I did hope we could be friends. I wanted more than just a business partner." Her words hung in the air, and Mark didn't know how to respond. He had always kept his emotions buried deep inside, afraid of letting anyone in. But now, sitting across from Eleanor, something inside him began to shift. Was he ready to let go of his walls? Was he ready to open up to this strange, complex woman who had, in her own way, tried to make this work? The tension between them lingered, but for the first time since their wedding, Mark felt something different. Maybe it was the rain outside or the way Eleanor had opened up to him. Whatever it was, it felt like a turning point, a moment that could change everything. Mark looked up at her, his expression softening. "Maybe we could start over," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we can try to figure this out, together." Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. She smiled, just a little, but it was enough to make Mark feel like maybe, just maybe, this partnership wasn't as hopeless as he had once thought. The days following their conversation marked a subtle shift in Mark and Eleanor's relationship. It wasn't much, but it was something, a glimmer of connection. They began to spend more time together, not as business partners, but as people who, for the first time, genuinely tried to understand each other. Eleanor would invite him to attend charity events, asking for his opinion on certain matters, while Mark would offer his thoughts on projects he had been working on. Their conversations, once strictly formal, began to include personal anecdotes, shared laughter, and even a few moments of silence that felt comfortable. It was a strange but pleasant feeling, something neither of them had expected. Mark had started to notice the little things about Eleanor, the way she always made sure everyone felt included at her events, how her smile could light up a room when she wasn't focused on business. For the first time, he found himself drawn to her, not for her wealth or her power, but for the woman beneath the business suit. Eleanor, in turn, noticed the change in Mark. He was beginning to open up more, showing sides of himself he had hidden before. His confidence had grown, and he no longer seemed like the overwhelmed, desperate young man he had been when they first met. He was still navigating the complexities of their arrangement, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was beginning to see Eleanor not just as a business partner, but as someone who was worthy of his trust. They had dinner together at the estate one evening, the first time they had shared a meal alone since their wedding. The soft hum of conversation filled the room, a light jazz tune playing in the background as they ate. Eleanor asked about his childhood, his dreams, the things he had once wanted to do before life had taken a different course. Mark hesitated at first, but then the words came. He told her about his father, about his struggles in law school, about his constant fear that he would never live up to his family's expectations. Eleanor listened intently, never interrupting, her gaze soft but steady. When he finished, she smiled gently. "You've been through a lot, Mark," she said quietly. "But you're stronger than you realize." Mark smiled back, but it was a bittersweet expression. "I don't always feel that way." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. The touch was brief, but it lingered in the air between them, and for a moment, it felt like there was more than just the business agreement between them. The moment passed, but the connection remained. Mark couldn't help but wonder if this was what he had been searching for all along, a partnership that could grow into something more. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor walked him to the door. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "It was nice." Mark nodded, his heart unexpectedly racing. "It was," he agreed, and for the first time, he truly meant it. As he left the estate, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The feelings that had begun to blossom between them were confusing. He wasn't sure if it was love, but it was something deep, something real. The next few days were filled with more of these quiet moments, small gestures of kindness and understanding. He noticed her more, the way she was always looking out for others, the way she was fiercely protective of the people she cared about. He found himself wanting to be part of that world, wanting to protect her the way she had always protected him. But there was still a wall between them. Neither of them had spoken about what was really happening between them, what this partnership might eventually become. Mark knew he needed to confront his feelings, but he wasn't ready. He wasn't sure what the consequences would be if he opened that door. But every day, as they grew closer, he felt like the door was slowly creaking open, and he knew that one day, he would have to decide whether to walk through it. Eleanor, too, had been thinking about what was happening between them. She had started to realize that she was no longer just fulfilling a business contract. She had begun to care about Mark, more than she had ever intended. She hadn't expected this, hadn't planned on it. But the more time they spent together, the more she saw the man Mark was becoming, the more she felt drawn to him. She didn't know what this meant for their future. She didn't know if they could make this work outside the confines of the agreement they had signed. But she knew one thing. Whatever this was between them, it was real. And she couldn't ignore it any longer. The days that followed felt different. Mark couldn't explain it, but there was a shift in the air between him and Eleanor. It wasn't dramatic, but the small moments, those brief, almost unnoticed exchanges, began to add up. He found himself looking for reasons to spend time with her. He didn't just want to talk about business anymore. He wanted to know more about her life, her past, the things that made her who she was. Eleanor, for her part, seemed to be feeling the same pull. There was a softness in her gaze when she looked at him now, a vulnerability that she had always kept hidden behind her composed exterior. She no longer treated him like a business partner, but as someone who mattered to her, someone she could confide in. And Mark realized that he had started to care about her more than he had ever expected. They were no longer just two people playing out a contract. They were starting to build something real, something that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, Eleanor invited him to a private dinner at the estate. It was just the two of them, no business associates, no distractions. It was the first time they had been alone together like this in weeks. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. They spoke about their childhoods, their dreams, their regrets. Eleanor told Mark about her late husband, how he had been the love of her life but had passed away unexpectedly, leaving her with a legacy of success but also a deep sense of loneliness. Mark listened, really listened, for the first time. He had always seen her as this powerful, untouchable figure, but now he saw her as a woman who had loved and lost, just like anyone else. He couldn't help but admire her strength, her ability to keep going despite everything. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. There was no longer any pretense between them. They weren't playing roles anymore. They were simply two people, sharing a moment, trying to understand each other. For a brief moment, Mark allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if this wasn't just a contract, if they weren't just pretending. But then the thought disappeared just as quickly as it came. He couldn't afford to get lost in those feelings. This was still a business arrangement, a deal they had made. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't want it to be just a deal. As Eleanor stood up to clear the dishes, she turned to him and smiled softly. "Thank you for tonight, Mark. I really enjoyed it." Mark stood up as well, his heart suddenly racing. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to tell her that he was starting to feel something for her, that he couldn't just pretend anymore. But instead, he just smiled back, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was nice," he said. "It wasn't much, but it was honest. And for now, that was enough." But as he left the estate that evening, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. Maybe it was just a small step, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Eleanor had opened up to him in a way she never had before, and for the first time, he felt like he was seeing the real her. Not the businesswoman, not the widow, but the woman who had loved and lost. The woman who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders and still kept going. As he drove home, Mark's mind raced with the possibilities. What did this mean for their future? Could they really make this work, or was he just fooling himself? He didn't know the answers, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The following days passed in a quiet, uncertain rhythm. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing between him and Eleanor, but he wasn't sure where it was leading. Every time they spoke, every time they shared a moment, it felt more like a real connection. But he was still haunted by the truth of their situation. Their marriage was nothing but a business deal, a contract, an arrangement made out of necessity. He tried to push those thoughts aside, to focus on the new dynamic that was slowly forming between them. But it wasn't easy. One evening, a few days after their dinner, Mark came home from a meeting to find Eleanor waiting for him. She was sitting in the living room, her expression unreadable, her hands clasped in front of her. There was a tension in the air, one that immediately made Mark uneasy. "Mark, we need to talk," Eleanor said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. Mark's stomach dropped. He hadn't seen her like this before. No calm composure, no control. She seemed vulnerable. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. Eleanor took a deep breath, looking at him with eyes that were no longer guarded. "I've been thinking a lot about what's happening between us," she said slowly. "And I think it's time we address the reality of our situation. This isn't just a contract anymore. is it? Mark froze, his heart pounding. He had hoped they could keep pretending, that the walls they had built around their emotions would hold up for a little while longer. But it was clear now that they couldn't hide from the truth. He took a step closer to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. I think I'm starting to feel something real, Mark," she said quietly. "And I can't ignore it anymore. I care about you, more than I should. And I don't know what that means for us, for this arrangement. But I think we need to decide what we really want." Mark felt the weight of her words sink in, and for the first time since this all began, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he hadn't been wrong to open his heart to her. Maybe this could be something more than a business deal, more than a contract that bound them together out of necessity. But the fear that had plagued him for so long still lingered. He wasn't sure how to navigate this new territory. "I don't know what to say," Mark admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect any of this to happen. I didn't expect to start caring about you like I do." Eleanor reached out and touched his hand, the gesture simple but grounding. "I never expected it either," she said softly. "But here we are." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their unspoken feelings. Mark wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore what was happening between them any longer. They were standing on the edge of something unknown, something that could either pull them together or tear them apart. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe we need to give this a chance," he said. "Maybe we need to see where this goes, without the contract, without the business arrangement." Eleanor's eyes brightened, and for the first time, Mark saw something more than the strong, composed woman he had come to know. He saw vulnerability, hope, and the possibility of something more. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded. "I'm sure." The air between them seemed to shift in that moment. The wall that had stood between them for so long seemed to crumble, leaving only the raw, honest truth. And in that truth, Mark realized something. He didn't just want this arrangement to work for the sake of convenience. He wanted it to work because, in some small, unexpected way, he had fallen for her. The following week, Mark and Eleanor found themselves navigating uncharted territory. Their conversation that night had changed everything. What had started as a business arrangement was now something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Mark could feel the shift in the air whenever they were together. There was no longer an awkward tension between them, no walls. Instead, there was something much more fragile and real, emotions they had both tried to bury beneath the surface. Eleanor, for her part, seemed just as unsure. She was still the strong, confident woman she had always been, but now there was a vulnerability in her eyes whenever she looked at Mark, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. And it wasn't just the way she looked at him. It was in the way they spoke, in the way they shared moments of silence, as if they both knew there was something happening between them that couldn't be ignored anymore. One evening, they found themselves at another charity event together, the kind of event that had once been part of the routine of their lives. But tonight, it felt different. Mark noticed at the moment they walked into the ballroom, the soft murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the polished smiles of the guests. But amidst all the luxury and pretense, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced before, as if the world outside no longer mattered. Eleanor was by his side, her hand lightly brushing against his, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was living in a world that wasn't his own. The evening passed in a blur of polite conversation, yet neither of them seemed to care much about the usual formalities. They shared a quiet moment on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It was just the two of them, away from the glitz and glamour of the event, and in that stillness, the weight of what had shifted between them felt even more real. "Mark," Eleanor said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking, maybe we've been running from something. Maybe we've been afraid to admit that this," she gestured between them, "isn't just a deal anymore." Mark turned to look at her, his heart racing at the honesty in her voice. He had been thinking the same thing, but hearing her say it aloud made it feel like a revelation. "I think you're right," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't expect any of this, but now that it's happening, I don't want to turn away from it." Eleanor smiled, a rare softness in her expression. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight," she said quietly. "But I think we should stop pretending that we're just business partners. Mark nodded. He didn't know what the future held, or how this would change things between them, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. The night ended with them standing together, watching the world below, but for Mark, everything had already shifted. He wasn't just living a contract anymore. He was living a life that had the potential to become something real, something he could never have imagined when he first agreed to this arrangement. The next few days were filled with more moments like that. Quiet exchanges, soft smiles. And yet, there was still the uncertainty of what was to come. Mark was still uncertain about what this relationship, this shift in their connection, meant for their future. But one thing had become clear: he didn't want to lose it. He didn't want to lose her. Eleanor, too, was caught between what had been and what could be. She had always been in control of her life, her business, her world. But now, there was a new kind of uncertainty, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The tension between them wasn't gone. It had simply transformed into something new, something neither of them could ignore. As the week drew to a close, Eleanor found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. She had invited Mark to dinner again, just the two of them, and as they sat together, the quiet was no longer uncomfortable. There was no pressure, no need to fill the silence with words. Just the two of them, together, trying to figure out what came next. The days that followed felt like a turning point for both Mark and Eleanor. They were no longer pretending, no longer bound by a contract that had once felt so cold and transactional. Instead, they were navigating the unfamiliar terrain of a relationship built on something deeper than just business. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was real. Mark had stopped questioning his feelings for Eleanor. He knew now that what he felt for her wasn't just a passing attraction or a fleeting desire. It was something substantial, something that had quietly crept into his heart. He cared for her, deeply, and that realization was both comforting and terrifying. Eleanor, too, had begun to embrace the change. She had always kept her emotions in check, focusing on her career, on her goals, on keeping everything in perfect order. But with Mark, she had started to let go, to allow herself to feel things she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She had spent so long trying to be strong, to be in control, that she had almost forgotten what it was like to let someone in, to trust them completely. But with Mark, it felt different. She no longer saw him just as a business partner. He had become someone she truly cared about. One evening, after a long week of meetings and events, Eleanor invited Mark to dinner at the estate. It was nothing fancy, just a quiet meal, just the two of them. They ate in the garden, the soft glow of string lights above them, and the night air cool but pleasant. There was no agenda, no distractions. Just the two of them, sharing a simple moment. After dinner, they walked together through the garden, their hands brushing occasionally, a comfortable silence between them. Eleanor stopped beside a fountain, her eyes drifting to the water. "Mark," she said quietly, her voice soft but serious. "I think we've both been avoiding the truth for a while now. We've been pretending that this arrangement was just business, just a deal. But I can't ignore what's between us anymore. I don't want to." Mark turned to her, his heart racing at her words. "I don't want to ignore it either," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I care about you, Eleanor. More than I ever expected." There was a pause, and in that moment, everything between them seemed to fall into place. The contract, the deal, they were no longer the focus. What mattered now was what they had built together, the connection they had forged through honesty and vulnerability. Eleanor looked at him, her expression soft but resolute. "Then let's stop pretending," she said. "Let's see where this goes, without the contract, without the business arrangement. Let's build something real." Mark smiled, his heart light with the weight of her words. "I'd like that," he said. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of certainty he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, there would be doubts, there would be moments of uncertainty. But they were no longer just playing out a role. They were choosing to be together, to build something genuine, something lasting. As they stood there, beneath the stars, hand in hand, Mark realized that he had finally found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. It wasn't wealth or status that had brought him to this moment. It was love, connection, and the courage to let go of the past and embrace the future. Eleanor's smile was the answer he needed. It was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had expected, but both of them wanted. A new chapter had begun, a real one, and together, they were ready to face whatever came next.